Claire Bennett's life had never been easy. But she had learned to endure. After her divorce 5 years ago, she had no choice but to stand on her own 2 feet. Raising her son Lucas with nothing but sheer determination and love, she had known from the beginning that she would get no help from her wealthy mother, Margaret Caldwell. Not once had Margaret offered a helping hand. Not when Claire was struggling to pay rent. Not when Lucas needed new clothes for school. And certainly not when Claire had to take on extra night shifts just to afford basic necessities. Yet, what stung the most wasn't just the lack of support, it was the blatant favoritism. While Claire fought to keep her head above water, her younger sister Olivia was showered with everything she could ever ask for. Margaret had always doted on Olivia, treating her like the golden child, the perfect daughter who could do no wrong. Olivia had never had to struggle a day in her life. If she wanted something, she got it: expensive vacations, designer clothes, a brand new car for her 18th birthday, all funded by their mother without hesitation. Claire, on the other hand, was always told to figure it out. When she was a child, Margaret constantly reminded her that she needed to be responsible, that she needed to stand on her own, but Olivia was never given the same lesson. Claire had learned to accept this cruel reality long ago, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. Lucas had grown up seeing the difference in treatment. He was a bright, kind-hearted boy, always full of life despite the hardships he and his mother faced. He never asked for much, never complained, but Claire could see the hurt in his eyes when his cousin Sophie, Olivia's daughter, received expensive gifts while he was handed something practical: a book. School supplies, never toys or anything fun. It was as if Margaret saw him as an obligation rather than a beloved grandson. One particular memory haunted Claire, a moment she could never forget. It was Lucas's 10th birthday, and Claire had saved up for months to throw him a small party at home. Nothing extravagant, just a homemade cake, some balloons, and a few of his school friends. But that same week, Margaret had thrown a lavish birthday party for Sophie at an upscale venue, with caterers, decorations, and an expensive magician to entertain the guests. Claire hadn't been invited, of course, but she had seen the pictures plastered all over social media. Lucas, with his innocent eyes, had asked her that night, "Mom, do you think Grandma loves me less than she loves Sophie?" Claire's heart had shattered. Of course not, sweetheart, she had lied, forcing a smile. She loves you in her own way. But deep down, she knew the truth. Margaret did it. Still, Claire refused to let bitterness consume her. She worked hard, pushing through exhaustion, balancing hospital shifts and single motherhood. She refused to let Lucas feel like he was any less valuable than his cousin. She attended every school event, cheered for him at every soccer game, helped him with homework even after long, grueling shifts. She may not have given him wealth, but she had given him love, attention, and unwavering support, things Margaret had never given to her. Yet, the financial struggle was relentless. Claire's salary as a nurse at the local hospital was stable but far from enough to afford luxuries. Rent, utilities, groceries, it all added up, leaving her with almost nothing to save for the future. The thought of college tuition loomed over her like a dark cloud. She knew that when the time came, Margaret would gladly pay for Sophie's education, while Lucas would be told to find his own way. She tried not to dwell on it too much. What mattered was the present. One morning, as Claire rushed to get Lucas ready for school, she found herself racing against the clock. It was one of those frantic mornings, where every second counted, yet everything seemed to slow her down. "Lucas, don't forget your lunch," she called, grabbing the packed meal from the kitchen counter. "Coming, Mom." Lucas's voice echoed from the bathroom. Claire sighed, glancing at the clock. If they didn't leave in 5 minutes, she would be late for her hospital shift. Being late meant getting scolded by her supervisor, which meant an even more stressful day ahead. Lucas finally ran out, his hair still damp, his backpack half-zipped. He flashed her a wide grin. That same bright, innocent smile. "Yes, Mom, can I go to Brian's house after school today?" he asked, stuffing his lunch into his backpack. "What about homework?" Claire asked, arching an eyebrow. "I'll finish it before I go, I promise." Claire hesitated, but then sighed and nodded. "All right, but be home by dinner." Thanks, Mom. Lucas beamed, rushing out the door. Claire grabbed her own bag and hurried after him. As she walked him to the bus stop, she felt that familiar weight in her chest, a mix of love, pride, and worry as the bus pulled away. She watched him wave at her through the window, and she whispered, "I love you, Lucas, more than anything." She got into her car and drove off to the hospital, completely unaware that in just a few hours, her entire world would come crashing down. The day had started like any other. Claire Bennett, a dedicated nurse, was rushing through the chaos of the hospital, tending to patients, administering medication, and checking vitals, all while mentally juggling the long list of things she had to do after her shift. The hours passed in a blur of beeping machines, hushed conversations, and the rhythmic footsteps of doctors and nurses moving with purpose. Then her phone rang. It wasn't an unusual occurrence. She often received calls from Lucas when he forgot something at home or needed a quick check-in, but the number on the screen wasn't his. It was an unknown number. Frowning, she stepped into an empty corridor and answered. "Hello, this is Claire." The voice on the other end was urgent, frantic even. "Ms. Bennett? This is Nurse Adams from Westfield Middle School. I'm calling about your son, Lucas." Claire felt her stomach drop. "Lucas? What happened? Is he all right?" Her voice came out higher than usual, trembling with panic. There was a brief hesitation before the nurse spoke again, her tone carefully measured, the way medical professionals delivered bad news. Lucas was in an accident after school. He was hit by a car while crossing the street. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The world around her suddenly felt distant, as though she were underwater, her thoughts muffling into a haze of fear. "What? How bad is it?" Her voice cracked. "He's been taken to St. Joseph's General Hospital's emergency room. He suffered a severe impact on his right side. The doctors will provide more details once you arrive. But you should come right away." The phone nearly slipped from her fingers. Claire barely registered her surroundings as she sprinted toward her supervisor's office, her pulse hammering in her ears. "Please, God, let him be okay. Let my baby be okay." She wasn't even sure what she said to her boss, something about an emergency, something about her son, but the next thing she knew, she was running to her car. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her keys, and she nearly reversed without checking the mirrors. The 15-minute drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Every red light, every slow-moving car, every second wasted on traffic, each moment stretched unbearably long. Claire gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. She whispered to herself over and over, "He's strong. He's strong. He's going to be okay." When she finally pulled into the hospital parking lot, she barely remembered turning off the engine before bursting through the emergency room doors. "Lucas Bennett," she gasped, nearly collapsing against the front desk. "My son, he was brought in from an accident." The receptionist scanned the records and pointed toward a hallway. "Dr. Morgan will update you shortly. Please follow me." Claire's legs threatened to give out and Then she saw him. Lucas lay on the hospital bed, small, fragile, and alarmingly still. His right arm was wrapped in bandages. An IV line snaked from his arm, and beeping monitors surrounded him. His face, her beautiful, always smiling son, was pale, swollen on one side, a thin cut running down his cheek. "Lucas," Claire choked out, rushing to his side. She grabbed his hand, squeezing gently, afraid to hurt him but desperate for him to feel her presence. His eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest moment, his glazed-over blue eyes met hers. "Mom?" His voice was weak, barely above a whisper. Claire bit back a sob. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." Before she could say anything else, a voice cleared behind her. She turned to see a doctor in a white coat, clipboard in hand, his expression serious but calm. "Ms. Bennett, I'm Dr. Morgan. Your son has suffered significant injuries. He has a fractured arm and internal bleeding. A CT scan also indicates damage to his liver." The words hit her like a physical blow. Claire swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the hospital bed for support. Liver damage?" She could barely force the words out. Dr. Morgan nodded. "We're stabilizing him now, but he will need emergency surgery." Surgery. The word sent a wave of cold dread crashing over her. Claire's chest tightened. A mother's worst fear suffocating her this time was running out. "Then do it. Please, Do whatever it takes. The doctor hesitated. There's just one issue we need to discuss. Your insurance will cover most of the surgery, but the deductible and additional hospitalization costs will require an out-of-pocket payment of $150. Claire's stomach dropped. What? Her voice came out as a whisper. We need an initial payment of at least $3 before proceeding. The administrator added, hospital policy. Claire felt like she was spiraling into a nightmare. Lucas was fighting for his life. And they were talking about money? She didn't have $3 sitting in her account. She could barely afford rent, let alone a massive medical bill. Her mind raced through options. Her credit card was nearly maxed out. Her savings barely touched 4 figures. And Lucas's father, Derek, was completely unreliable. There was only one person she could call. Her mother. The thought made her sick. Margaret had never lifted a finger to help her before, why would she now? But there was no time for pride. No time for resentment. Claire pulled out her phone with trembling hands and dialed the number she hadn't called in months. Mom, please, I need your help. Lucas has been in an accident. He needs emergency surgery. I don't have the money. Please, can you lend it to me? A long, agonizing silence followed. Then, Margaret's voice came through, eerily calm. I'm sorry, Claire, but I already promised Olivia I'd help fund Sophie's study abroad program. You understand, don't you? Claire's blood turned to ice. Her grandson's life was on the line, and she was prioritizing her golden child's daughter over him. The betrayal was so deep it felt suffocating. Tears burned at Claire's eyes as she whispered, Mom, please, he could die. Margaret let out a slow sigh. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You always do. Claire's phone slipped from her grip as she sank into the chair outside Lucas's room. Her entire world collapsing around her. Claire sat in the cold, sterile hospital hallway, her body numb, her heart pounding in her chest. The words from her mother still echoed in her mind. A cruel reminder of where she stood in her family's hierarchy. I already promised Olivia I'd help fund Sophie's study abroad program. You understand, don't you? Claire clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Understand? How could she ever understand? How could her mother, a woman who had built her wealth through real estate, who had always paraded herself as a pillar of strength and family, choose a luxury over the life of her own grandson? Tears burned at the back of Claire's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent her entire life swallowing disappointment, pretending that her mother's favoritism didn't cut her to the bone. But this was beyond anything she had ever imagined. Lucas was dying. Her baby, her only son, was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, fighting for his life, and Margaret had turned her back on him. A choked sob escaped her lips, but she quickly covered her mouth, forcing herself to stay strong. Crying wouldn't solve anything. She had to think. Her bank account balance flashed in her mind, barely over $1,000. She needed $3 now. With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Who could she call? Her best friend, Natalie? No, she was struggling with bills of her own. Her coworkers? They barely made enough to cover their own expenses. Then, a name appeared on the screen, Olivia Morrison. Claire's younger sister, their mother's favorite. A bitter taste filled her mouth. Of course, Olivia, who had never had to struggle a day in her life. Olivia, who had been handed every opportunity on a silver platter. Olivia, who was now receiving their mother's money to send her daughter to study abroad. Claire hesitated. Would Olivia even help her? She exhaled sharply. It didn't matter. Lucas was all that mattered. With shaking fingers, she hit the call button. It rang once, twice. Then, a voice. Claire? This is unexpected. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. Olivia, I need your help. A pause. What kind of help? Claire shut her eyes for a brief second, willing herself to stay calm. Lucas was in an accident. He's in emergency surgery, but the hospital won't proceed unless I can pay $3 up front. I don't have it. Please, Olivia, I wouldn't be asking if it wasn't life or death. The silence on the other end stretched so long it became unbearable. Then, Olivia sighed. I'm sorry, Claire, I really am, but Mom already gave me the money for Sophie's program, and I can't just return it. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for her. A sharp pain stabbed through Claire's chest. So fierce it nearly took her breath away. Once in a lifetime? What about Lucas's life? Claire's grip tightened on the phone. Olivia, this is your nephew, your own flesh and blood. I know, Olivia said, her voice softer, almost guilty, but you're strong. Claire, you'll find a way. The phone line clicked dead. Claire's hands trembled as she slowly lowered the phone. She had been abandoned, not just by her mother, but by the entire family. A deep, suffocating rage boiled inside her, raw and unforgiving. Margaret had the money, she had it. She could transfer the funds in seconds. But she refused, because Claire wasn't the daughter she cared about. Because Lucas wasn't the grandchild she doted on. They were disposable. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. Was this really happening? Was she really alone in this fight? No, not. Lucas still had her. And if no one else would fight for him, she would. She needed to act. Marching toward the front desk, she pulled out her last credit card and slammed it onto the counter. Charge as much as you can. The receptionist hesitated, glancing at the screen. Ms. Bennett, this card is near its limit. I don't care, Claire snapped. Take whatever you can. I'll find the rest. The woman hesitated, then nodded. The transaction went through, but it wasn't enough. $1,500 remaining. Claire's mind raced. She could beg her coworkers. She could sell whatever she had left. She could. Ms. Bennett? She turned sharply, her heart hammering. A man stood near the hallway, his expression unreadable. It took her a second to recognize him. Drive. Morgan. We're proceeding with the surgery, he said, watching her closely. Claire froze. But, the payment. Dr. Morgan smiled faintly. It's been handled. Her breath hitched. What? Before she could say anything else, a familiar voice called her name. She turned, and there stood Rachel, her sister, panting from running, her face pale, her hands gripping a check. I took care of it, Rachel said breathlessly. I paid it. Claire blinked in shock. Rachel? The same sister who had always been showered with their mother's love? The same sister who had never fought for her? How? Why? Claire whispered. Rachel exhaled, her lips trembling. Because I finally saw it. Claire, I saw how Mom treats you. How she treats Lucas. And her voice cracked. I can't stand by anymore. Tears welled up in Claire's eyes. For the first time in years, someone had chosen her. Someone had chosen Lucas. She didn't hesitate. She threw her arms around Rachel, holding her as if her life depended on it. Thank you, she choked out. Rachel held her just as tight. And this time, she never would be again. Claire sat in the dimly lit hospital waiting room, exhaustion weighing on her like a heavy blanket. It had been a long night. A night of heartbreak and revelation. Hours ago, she had learned the full extent of her mother's betrayal, not just her refusal to help save Lucas but the truth about Margaret's financial ruin. The woman who had lorded her wealth over Claire her entire life. The woman who had funded Olivia's lavish lifestyle while Claire struggled to put food on the table. Was drowning in debt. The irony was almost laughable. Almost. Now, the silence in the hospital was deafening. The beeping of machines, the soft murmur of nurses in the hallway, all of it faded into the background as Claire's mind raced. Her mother had spent years pretending she was invincible. Yet she had crumbled the moment her carefully curated image had been threatened. And in the end, Rachel, Margaret's golden child, had been the one to step up. Rachel, the sister Claire had resented for so long, had chosen her this time, had chosen Lucas. Claire glanced down at her hands, still trembling from the rush of emotions. Could she ever forgive Margaret? Could she ever truly let go of all the pain, all the years of being cast aside? A slow creak of the waiting room door broke through her thoughts. She looked up, her stomach twisting at the sight of her mother standing hesitantly in the doorway. Margaret had always been an imposing figure, her presence commanding, her posture unwavering. But tonight, she looked small. The weight of her own mistakes had settled onto her shoulders, leaving her looking fragile in a way Claire had never seen before. Claire felt her body tense. She wasn't ready for this. Claire. Margaret's voice was hoarse, uncertain. How's Lucas? Claire exhaled sharply, standing from her chair. She wanted to scream. She wanted to demand how her mother had the audacity to ask that question after everything. but she forced herself to remain composed. The surgery went well, she said flatly, but it was a close call. Margaret's lips trembled, but she nodded. I wanted to be here. Claire scoffed, crossing her arms. You wanted to be here? You mean after you refused to help? After you chose Olivia's daughter's study abroad trip over your grandson's life? Margaret flinched as if Claire had slapped her. I didn't. Didn't what? Claire snapped, her voice rising. Didn't mean to prioritize Sophie's trip? Didn't mean to let your grandson almost die because of your pride? What part of this wasn't intentional? Mom? Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. But Claire wasn't moved. Not this time. I was scared, Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. I was ashamed. Claire let out a bitter laugh. Ashamed? That's what this is about. You didn't want to admit to the world that you lost your money. So you let your grandson suffer instead? Margaret's face crumpled. I thought you'd find a way. Claire, you always do. And there it was, the final knife to the gut. Claire's body shook with rage. Because I've always had to. She hissed. Because you never gave me a choice. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Then, Margaret finally whispered, I'm sorry. Claire inhaled sharply. Sorry? She had waited years to hear those words. But now that they had finally been spoken, they felt hollow. Sorry doesn't change what happened, Claire said, her voice trembling. Sorry doesn't erase the years of favoritism. It doesn't erase the nights I went without because you were too busy making sure Olivia had everything she ever wanted. And it sure as hell doesn't change the fact that you turned your back on your own grandson. Margaret looked devastated. I know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I failed you. Claire clenched her jaw. Yeah, you did. Another stretch of silence. Then, Margaret swallowed hard. I want to fix things, she said. I want to make it right. Claire let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. You can't. Margaret reached out hesitantly, but Claire stepped back. The distance between them had never felt wider. Quote, no, Claire cut her off. You don't get to beg for forgiveness just because you finally got caught in your own lies. Margaret's breath hitched, but Claire pushed forward. You need to fix yourself. Mom, you need to figure out who you are when you're not pretending to be some powerful woman who has everything under control. And maybe then, maybe, we can talk. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she nodded. Claire watched as her mother, once untouchable, once unshakable, finally broke. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully forgive Margaret. But for the first time in her life, Claire wasn't the one left standing in the ruins. She turned away, walking back toward the waiting room. Lucas needed her. And this time, she wasn't alone. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window, casting a soft glow over Lucas's sleeping face. Claire sat by his bedside, her fingers gently brushing over his bandaged hand. The past few days had been the most terrifying of her life. But now, in the quiet stillness of this room, she finally allowed herself to breathe. Her son was safe. The worst was over. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Rachel standing there, hesitant but determined. The sight of her younger sister, the sister Claire had once resented. The sister who had always been given the easy road, now standing in the doorway with the weight of guilt and redemption in her eyes, was almost surreal. Hey, Rachel said softly. Claire nodded, motioning for her to come in. Rachel hesitated before stepping closer, pulling up a chair beside her. There had been years of silence between them, years of misunderstandings and unspoken bitterness. But now, after everything, there was only the raw truth. Rachel cleared her throat. I just wanted to check on Lucas. How's he doing? Claire exhaled, brushing a strand of hair from her son's forehead. Better than expected. The doctors say he'll make a full recovery. But it'll take time. Rachel nodded, chewing on her bottom lip. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. Claire's fingers stilled. She had spent a lifetime waiting for those words, from her mother. From Rachel. From the family who had never truly seen her. Now that they were here, she wasn't sure what to do with them. Rachel continued, her voice thick with emotion. Mom told me everything. About her debt. About how Rachel stopped, swallowing hard. I can't believe she lied like that. That she almost let Lucas. Her voice broke. And she wiped at her eyes, trying to keep her composure. Claire studied her sister carefully. This wasn't the Rachel she had grown up with, the spoiled golden child who had been handed everything while Claire fought for scraps. This was someone else, someone who had finally opened her eyes. I was angry with you, Claire admitted, her voice quiet but firm. For a long time, for how easy you had it, for how Mom always put you first. Rachel flinched, nodding. I know, and you had every right to be. I was blind to it for so long. Claire, I thought that's just how things were supposed to be. That Mom loved us equally. Just in different ways. She let out a bitter laugh. But that was never true. Was it? Claire sighed, shaking her head. No, it wasn't. Rachel looked down at her hands. After I called Mom out, I started thinking about everything. The birthdays, the gifts, the way she always made excuses when she hurt you. I'm ashamed. Claire, I should have seen it sooner. Silence stretched between them, but for once, it wasn't filled with resentment. Rachel reached out, hesitant but hopeful. I want to do better. I want to be there for you. For Lucas, if you'll let me. Claire hesitated. Trust wasn't something she could rebuild overnight. The wounds ran too deep. The scars too raw. But Rachel had been the one to save Lucas when their mother turned her back. That had to mean something. I don't know if I can forget everything, Claire admitted. Rachel nodded. I don't expect you to. She took a shaky breath. I just want a chance to make it right. Claire studied her sister, really looking at her for the first time in years. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. She reached out, taking Rachel's hand in hers. We'll see. Rachel's lips trembled into a small, relieved smile. Just then, a soft groan came from the hospital bed. Both sisters turned as Lucas slowly blinked his eyes open. His voice hoarse but steady. Mom? Claire leaned forward, her heart swelling with relief. I'm here, sweetheart. Lucas glanced between her and Rachel, his tired expression flickering with confusion. Grandma and Aunt Rachel, were they really here? Claire exchanged a look with Rachel before nodding. Yes, baby, they were. Lucas let out a small hum, exhaustion still weighing on him. Weird, he muttered before closing his eyes again. Rachel chuckled softly, wiping at her eyes again. Yeah, kiddo, it is weird. Claire let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Maybe this wasn't a perfect ending. Maybe the pain of the past would never fully fade. But for the first time in a long time, there was hope. And that was enough. 6 months had passed since that fateful night in the hospital. The night when everything shattered, and then, somehow, slowly began to rebuild. Claire stood in her tiny kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air as she gazed out the window. The sun was rising, painting the sky with hues of gold and orange. A new day, a new beginning. A knock at the door broke her from her thoughts. She turned, hesitating for a moment before walking over and opening it. There stood her mother, Evelyn. Claire hadn't seen her mother since that night in the hospital. Since the moment she had begged, pleaded, for help. Only to be turned away in favor of her sister's ambitions. Even now, just looking at her mother brought back a storm of emotions. Anger, pain, betrayal. Evelyn shifted uncomfortably on the doorstep, clutching a small paper bag in her hands. I brought breakfast. Claire folded her arms, leaning against the doorframe. Why are you here, Mom? Her mother sighed, looking older than Claire had ever seen her. The weight of guilt had carved deep lines into her face. Her once perfectly styled hair now showing streaks of silver. I wanted to see Lucas, she admitted, and I wanted to see you. Claire's jaw tightened. You mean after you walked away when he needed you the most? Evelyn flinched. I know I was wrong. Claire, she exhaled, her voice breaking slightly. I was too ashamed to tell you the truth. I failed. I lost everything, and instead of admitting it, I tried to act like I still had control. I thought I could fix things on my own. I thought you didn't need me. Claire's chest tightened. Wasn't that the problem all along? That Evelyn had never truly believed Claire needed, or deserved, her help. You thought wrong, Claire said, her voice cold. Her mother nodded. I know, and I can never undo what I did. She hesitated, shifting the bag in her hands. But I want to try to make things right. Claire wanted to scoff. How could anything be made right after a lifetime of neglect? After years of being pushed aside while her sister was given everything? Still, something in her mother's face, *, a quiet, desperate sincerity, * made her pause. How? Claire asked, crossing her arms. Evelyn took a deep breath. I sold the house, she said. I paid off as much debt as I could. And I moved into a small apartment near the senior center. I got a job there, helping with activities. It's different from what I used to do, but I like it. Claire's eyes widened slightly. Her mother had sold the house? The house that had once been a symbol of success, of pride, of superiority? The house she had always boasted about? Why? Claire asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. Evelyn looked down. Because I had to let go. Of the lies. Of the appearances. Of pretending to be someone I'm not anymore. A silence stretched between them, thick with years of pain and misunderstandings. Then Evelyn did something Claire had never seen her do before. She lowered her head, not in defiance, not in frustration, but in genuine humility. I don't expect forgiveness, she said quietly. I just want a chance. To be a better mother. A better grandmother, if you'll let me. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. For years, she had imagined this moment. Imagined her mother finally admitting the truth. Finally acknowledging the damage she had done. But what was she supposed to do now? Could she just let her in? Before she could answer, a small voice interrupted them. Grandma? Both women turned to see Lucas standing at the hallway entrance, rubbing his tired eyes. He was thinner now, still recovering, but the color had returned to his cheeks. Evelyn's breath hitched as she looked at him. Oh, Lucas, she whispered, stepping forward. He glanced between them, sensing the tension in the air. Then, to Claire's surprise, he took a hesitant step forward. Did you really sell the big house? He asked. His voice filled with childlike curiosity. Evelyn gave a soft laugh. Nodding. Yes, sweetheart, I did. Lucas studied her for a moment. Then nodded. Good. It was too big anyway. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Maybe forgiveness wasn't something that happened all at once. Maybe it wasn't even something she was ready for. But for the first time, she saw her mother not as the untouchable woman who had always held power over her, but as someone human, flawed, trying. And for now, that was enough. Claire stepped aside, holding the door open. Come in, Mom. Evelyn blinked in surprise, but she didn't hesitate. She stepped inside, toward a second chance. As the months passed, Claire slowly began to rebuild the shattered pieces of her life. She wasn't naive. Trust, once broken, wasn't something easily mended. Her relationship with her mother remained fragile, delicate like a vase that had been shattered and glued back together. There were cracks, visible reminders of all the damage done. But at least now, for the first time in her life, Evelyn was trying, and Claire was cautiously allowing her to try. Yet, there was one battle that remained unresolved. Her father. Claire had always assumed that if anyone could change, it would be her mother. Despite everything, Evelyn had shown glimpses of regret, signs that she wished things had been different. But her father? He had been the immovable wall, the unwavering force of judgment and favoritism that had always loomed over her. Which was why, when she heard his voice over the phone one evening, she felt her stomach tighten. Claire. His voice was as stern as ever. But there was something else in it. A weight, a strain. She gripped the phone, unsure of how to respond. Dad. There was a pause. Then, his next words made her grip the counter for balance. I'm selling the house. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She had assumed that Evelyn had sold it behind his back, that he would never part with it. That house had been more than a home, it had been a monument to his pride, his status, his unshakable belief in his own authority. You're selling the house? She repeated, her voice carefully neutral. I have no choice, he admitted. His tone was clipped, forced, as though saying the words physically hurt him. Your mother left. The money is gone. The debt is overwhelming. I can't keep it anymore. So that was it. Not regret, not a change of heart. Just necessity. Claire closed her eyes, gripping the phone tighter. She should have known better. Her father wasn't calling her out of remorse. He was calling her because he had run out of options. What do you want from me, Dad? She asked flatly. Another pause. Then, in a voice that lacked the usual command, he muttered, we should talk. Face to face. Face to face. The thought made her pulse quicken. She had spent her whole life trying to gain his approval, trying to make him see her. But now, she wasn't the desperate daughter begging for scraps of attention. She wasn't the girl who had been pushed aside for the sake of her sister's comfort. Now, she held the power. Still, part of her needed to know, was there anything left in him that resembled a father? Against her better judgment, she agreed. The next evening, she met him at a small diner on the outskirts of town. It was a far cry from the upscale restaurants he used to frequent. And that alone told Claire just how much had changed. When she walked in, she spotted him immediately. He looked different, not physically, but in the way he carried himself. His usual arrogance had been replaced with something heavier. She sat down across from him, not bothering with pleasantries. Say what you need to say. He exhaled sharply, clearly not used to being spoken to this way. He adjusted the sleeves of his shirt before finally meeting her eyes. Your mother tells me you've been doing well, he said, that Noah is recovering, that you're working toward becoming head nurse. She stared at him, waiting. He cleared his throat. That's good. I'm glad. Claire felt her fingers tighten around her coffee cup. It was the closest thing to praise he had ever given her. Yet it rang hollow. She took a slow sip before speaking. Why are you really here? Dad? He hesitated. Then, finally, he sighed. I need help. The words were like a slap to the face. Help? She repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. He nodded, his fingers drumming against the table. Your mother left. And with everything happening, I can't handle it alone. The house is going to be sold. But until then, I need a place to stay. Just for a while. Claire let out a bitter laugh. You want me to take you in? After everything? His jaw tightened. You're my daughter. She set her cup down forcefully. Oh, now I'm your daughter? When I was struggling, when Noah was on an operating table, when I was begging for help, I wasn't your daughter then. I was just someone who always managed on her own, wasn't I? No. She cut him off. You don't get to do this. You don't get to walk back into my life because you have nowhere else to go. The air between them was thick with tension. Years of resentment boiling to the surface. I gave everything I had to this family, he said, his voice low. And now, I have nothing left. Claire stared at him, her emotions warring inside her. There had been a time when she would have given anything to hear even a fraction of vulnerability from him. But now she realized something. She didn't owe him anything. Slowly, she leaned forward. You had a family, Dad, and you threw it away for the illusion of success. You don't get to ask for our help now that it's all crumbling. He looked at her, searching for some trace of the daughter who had once longed for his approval. But she wasn't that girl anymore. She stood up, leaving a few dollars on the table for the coffee. I hope you figure things out, she said quietly, but I can't be your safety net. And with that, she walked away, leaving her father behind. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel small in his presence. She felt free. The weight of her father's plea lingered in Claire's mind long after she had walked out of the diner. She had always dreamed of this moment, the day she could finally stand up to him. Refuse to let his presence dictate her life. But now that it had happened, a strange hollowness settled in her chest. Was this truly the ending she wanted? Her father had been the source of so much of her pain. He had chosen favoritism. He had abandoned her in her times of need. And when Noah's life had been hanging in the balance, he had done nothing. And yet, seeing him now, humbled, broken, defeated, it didn't bring the satisfaction she had once longed for. Instead, it stirred something else, something she wasn't sure she wanted to acknowledge. Regret. Not regret for refusing him, but regret that their story had come to this. For days, Claire wrestled with her emotions. She threw herself into her work, into Noah's recovery, into every possible distraction, but the echoes of her father's words haunted her. Every night, as she lay in bed, she replayed the way he had looked at her, like a man drowning, reaching for anything to keep himself afloat. And then, one evening, everything came to a head. It was late when her mother, Evelyn, called. Claire had almost ignored the call, still not entirely comfortable with their fragile truce. But something in her mother's voice made her sit up. Claire, it's your father, Evelyn said, her voice strained. He's in trouble. A chill ran down Claire's spine. What do you mean? There was a heavy pause before Evelyn finally answered. He's drinking again. Claire's grip on the phone tightened. Of course he was. She should have seen it coming. The man who had always prided himself on control, on never showing weakness, now that he had lost everything. What else did he have left? Where is he? Claire asked, already grabbing her coat. At the old house, Evelyn whispered. He refuses to leave, says he won't sell it. I think he's completely spiraling. Claire closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. She had every right to ignore this. After all the years of neglect, after the way he had abandoned her time and time again, she had no obligation to save him. And yet, something inside her refused to let it go. She arrived at the house just past midnight. The sight of it sent a strange mix of emotions through her. It was the house she had once dreamed of escaping from, and yet here she was, standing at its doorstep once more. The lights inside flickered dimly, and as she stepped inside, the scent of alcohol was thick in the air. And then she saw him. Her father sat slumped in the living room, an empty bottle dangling from his hand. The man who had always held himself with such power, who had ruled their family with an iron grip, now looked small. His shoulders were hunched, his eyes distant, glassy. For a moment, Claire just stood there, taking it all in. You came, he muttered, barely lifting his head. Yeah, she said, her voice unreadable. Silence stretched between them. The air was thick with things left unsaid. He let out a bitter chuckle. Funny, isn't it? I spent my whole life building something I thought would last, and now it's all gone. He looked around the house, his gaze unfocused. Your mother left. Rachel won't speak to me. And you walked away too. Claire crossed her arms. What did you expect, Dad? You pushed us all away for years. You chose your pride over your family. Now, when you have nothing left, you suddenly want us back? He flinched at her words, but he didn't deny them. Instead, he ran a hand over his face. Exhausted. I don't know how to fix it, he admitted, voice hoarse. I don't know if I can. For the first time in her life, he wasn't making excuses. He wasn't shifting the blame. He was simply lost. Claire swallowed hard, her emotions warring inside her. She had every reason to turn around and walk away. But a voice inside her whispered, if you do, you'll never get another chance to make this right. You can start by selling the house, she said finally. He stiffened. Keeping it won't bring back the past. She interrupted. Let it go, Dad. You don't need to hold on to this anymore. His gaze met hers, searching for something. Then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he murmured. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. As Claire stepped outside, the night air felt different, lighter, as if, for the first time, she wasn't carrying the weight of the past alone. Maybe they would never have the perfect father-daughter relationship. But at least, for the first time in her life, there was hope.